Hey, good evening, everyone, and thanks for stopping in for another exciting episode of Issue at Hand, wherein we will be reviewing Daredevil number 181, the famous Death of Elektra issue of Daredevil, one of Frank Miller's seminal works, one of his earliest works. And tonight we've got a panel of our regulars and a special guest, and I will start bringing them in. First, we'll bring in Ben. How are you doing tonight, Ben?
Hey, doing good. How are you?
Good. Excited to get started. Talk about Daredevil.
Yeah. This one I'm excited about in a different way than some of the other ones we've been doing. So, yeah.
All right. And we'll bring in the Coach Vic 7. Good to see you, Victor. How you doing?
I'm doing all right. I'm excited about this one too.
Sweet. And then we've got the fantastic Mr. Cheese. How you doing tonight, Mr. Cheese?
I'm doing fantastic, obviously. And I'm excited too. This has been one of my favorite books so far.
Sweet. And then I will bring in our guest for the night. This is Brion Salazar from the Around Comics podcast. So, Brian, you go by Sal usually, right?
I do, yeah. I grew up with another Brian, so I had to go by Salazar was my last name, obviously, and that's what everyone called me, and then it just got shortened to Sal, and most people through my life have called me Sal.
All right, cool. So this is a story where we bring in our panel, our regular panel, and a guest, and we ask our guests, what's your favorite comic book? So tonight, Brian is offering up, like I said, Daredevil 181. And we're going to start chopping that book up in a minute. But first, let's get to know Brian a little bit better. Brian, you started on the Around Comics podcast. We were chatting just a little bit before the show, around 2006. And you've got two partners with you. Can you kind of explain what you do on the Around Comics podcast?
Sure. Yeah. Chris Niesman and Tom Caters and I are three old comic book fans and friends. We met around end of 2015 or 2005, and I was not listening to podcasts at the time, but Chris had been listening to a few different comic book podcasts. I was going to a lot of comic book conventions and had known some people in the industry at the time, and we just kind of got to know each other through work, and then we decided we wanted to try and do a podcast. And I was like, I could do this. There's no problem with this. I can talk all day. You got to kind of stop me from talking, so that's not a problem. And we went to a convention one year and did a bunch of interviews with pros and kind of went from there, and we've been doing it since then. Took a break around 2010, different things in our lives, kids, marriage, moving, different things, but then we've just recently come back and the three of us are doing it all over again. So we talk about comics, we talk with comic book professionals, and just try and really spread the love of comics. We've always tried to just share what we enjoy and not really be too critical about things, just kind of talk about what we like and not about what we dislike. There's enough of that on the internet, so we kind of try and just really discuss the things that we enjoy.
I think that's one of the things that I really enjoyed about your show and some of the other podcasts that were really that did really well, that were popular, were successful. You guys always usually kept it pretty positive, where, like you said, you dwelled on kind of the great work and maybe just ignored, all the lesser works, I guess. And
yeah, there's enough criticism out there. There's enough people bashing things and attacking things, and it was never something we wanted to do. And we sort of fell into this pattern of talking about smaller books, independent books, a lot of Image books and IDW and those kind of books at the time, because we thought, well, we liked that stuff, but we also thought we might be able to help those books to some degree. We weren't going to do much for X-Men, but right. For a small book, we could do that, and we did, and we got to know a lot of creators that way as well. So it worked out for us in that regard.
Hey, we've got a comment from Dave Enrique. He says, I heard from Comic Geek Speak podcast that this issue was covered as part of a pop culture college class.
Wow.
That would not surprise me in the least if that's the case.
Yeah, that wouldn't shock me at all. I mean, it's well, we'll get into it, but there's definitely reasons why people should study it.
So how you found kind of getting into the YouTube side of it, you guys have rolled out pretty strong. You've had some pretty impressive guests recently.
It wasn't a plan. It was just sort of I was talking to Chris again. We were chatting on just texting back and forth one day, and I had been doing other podcasts. I always had something going on. I have a martial arts podcast that I talk about. And I had a couple of other, kind of geek related podcasts that I was doing, but the Around Comics one was always the special one. It was always the three of us. We had a great chemistry together and we always had fun doing it. So I just kind of threw it out there to him. Hey, what do you think about doing Around Comics again? And he was up for it. And then we contacted Tom and he was up for it. And we had always done just audio. We never did video. But I was like, well, let's give it a shot and try. Why not? Everyone seems to be doing live streaming and YouTube. So I figured we'd try it. And the first 3 or 4 were complete disasters. And I couldn't get the audio to sync up and nothing seemed to work. But I kind of worked our way through it. Like I said, the funny thing was when we were doing the podcast, one of the niches that we kind of filled was smaller books, and we got to know a lot of creators before they became big time creators, before they went on to work for Marvel or DC or that kind of thing. And we got to be friends with a lot of them. So now going back and calling these guys up or emailing them and saying, hey, would you want to talk? It's kind of an easy thing for us because we have a lot of relationships with those guys.
Yeah. So Ben, I think between everyone else on the panel, you probably have the most exposure to Around Comics. Were you a regular listener when they, like back in the day, back in the thousands?
No, I just heard about them. No, back in the day when I started podcasting, it was because of webcomic podcasts. There's a lot of those, and that's what got me into it. And so then there was the big names or whatever that you'd hear people talking about. My co-host on Welcome to Level 7, he listened to it, I think, but no, I hadn't. Yeah.
Okay.
No,
son of a bitch.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Yeah, sorry.
The funny thing now is, we were pretty popular at one time, and then we disappeared, and now we're kind of back in a different capacity, and we're just doing it for our fun. It's fun for us to do it.
Yeah.
But like we had Tom King on because we've known Tom before he was ever a comic book writer. We knew him. He was a fan of our show, and people were commenting about, like, if someone had left a comment like, wow, these guys seem really popular. I've never heard of this comic book podcast before. And I was like, yeah, well, we were at one time. We were pretty popular, and nobody cares about us now, but it's still fun for us.
Yeah, I think that's why everyone does all this. I think once you get into the YouTube side of it, there is kind of an established, we call the YouTube comic book community, where we see familiar names like Dave Enrique and Rob Boswell are. There are folks that kind of hop around from show to show, and a lot of people like to watch live, and some people can't make their schedules work, and they come back and watch rewinds and things like that. But there's a lot of, much like what you guys are doing, it's all positivity. It's all people supporting other people, kind of cheering them on as they grow their collection, pointing out new books to each other, that kind of thing. So it's all fun. It's all part of just enjoying comic books as a hobby or as a collectible or as an art form. And I think you guys do it back in the day, and I think you're doing it. You're starting doing it now. You're doing a great job of really pushing the art form side of it, what comics can do, what they can be, as a higher form of art, other than just a collectible, other than just a cover.
Well, one of the things with comics, I've been reading comics since I was 9 years old. And Chris has been reading them since he was young, and Tom as well. And we have always loved the medium of comic books. And, with the sort of groundswell of the movies and everything that's happening over the last 10, 15 years with comics and how the other mediums have gravitated towards these stories and these characters, sometimes you lose the fact that it all started with a pen and paper and somebody writing and drawing these comics, and the work that's gone into these characters and the creators for decades that, did this without any fanfare, without much reward at all. And a lot of them died penniless. Unfortunately, there's a long history of that kind of thing in this industry. And that's always been something that's been near and dear to our heart of trying to give credit and due to these guys that, whose work we loved. And the bigger the Spider-Man gets, the more popular the X-Men get, or the Avengers, or whoever it is, we always want to make sure that the men and women that created these characters and brought them along for decades, when really no one cared about them other than a small culture, we want to make sure they get their credit. And so that's always, it's not something we openly talk about, but it is something in all of our minds all the time. We have a deep appreciation for them, and it's just something we kind of strive to do and have some fun. It's a underlying part of our show.
Yep. All right, so let's start digging into the book a little bit. Again, we're talking about Daredevil 181, and Brian, can you tell us kind of how you first encountered this book?
Well, I bought it. This is my copy that I purchased in 1981 when I was 10 years old, off of a spinner rack at a 7-Eleven by my house. That's no longer there. The 7-Eleven's still there. No, actually, I don't even think the 7-Eleven's still there. But I had started reading comics about 9 spinner racks. There was a couple of there was a department store, there was a 7-Eleven, and there was another small pharmacy, and they all had spinner racks, various comics. And I think I started with something like Captain Carrot and the Amazing Zoo Crew, I think, was sort of my first comic book. But I quickly started reading things I probably shouldn't have been reading at 10 and 11 years old. Daredevil being one of those comics. And I think this wasn't the first Daredevil issue that I had bought. There's a few before this, but it was right around Frank Miller's beginning of run of Daredevil. And it was something that really, as a 10-year-old, the violence and the sort of darkness of it was something I gravitated towards immediately, because I knew my parents would, kill me if they found out that I was reading something like that.
I think this is one of those books that may be one of the early examples of a comic book that doesn't talk down to a kid, or maybe even ignores the fact that its audience is actually a kid. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I have never. This is the first time I've ever read a Daredevil book ever, and so I was kind of surprised at how graphic the violence was and all that kind of stuff. I was familiar with Daredevil through Spider-Man because that's what I grew up reading. Mm-hmm. So this is something new for me where I'm just like, oh, okay, so this really was kind of more extreme than most stuff, I guess. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I was kind of surprised by that. I mean, flinging that card, slicing 2 necks in this issue. It's like, wow, okay, yeah. But that was interesting to me.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because Daredevil was sort of originally a Spider-Man knockoff. He was kind of they were trying to capture another audience for that character, and he wasn't really well received. He was it was a failing book when Frank Miller started doing the art, and I can't think of the writer at the time before Frank started writing, but it was much more of a sort of swashbuckler book, or much more of an adventure book. And I think, to me, it feels like Frank was looking at like Scorsese films and that kind of, that sort of cinema of the 70s.
Yeah.
And Sidney Lamont, sorry. That kind of stuff. And probably that's what he was into and wanted to translate into comics. And I mean, this book in particular was dark, and the violence was, brutal. But to me, what struck me reading it again today, I read it again, this morning, and it was the buildup. It was the psychological buildup of it, and how Bullseye was deranged, and he was disturbed, and he had been, sitting with this failure and this shame that Daredevil had given him, and sitting in prison and rotting away, and then being told by the Punisher that his job's being taken away by this new assassin Elektra. All these things, and just culminates. I think that makes the violence even more visceral. Like there was a feeling of like he's off the wall. He's completely unhinged. And I don't think we really saw that in comics much before this. I think
even the Joker at the time, he was kind of crazy maniacal, but he wasn't Killing Joke level of crazy and maniacal, and that's kind of where Bullseye is in this.
Yeah.
Ben, you said that Frank Miller was a creator that you were very interested in. What can you tell us about your thoughts or anything about his background? What?
Well, I think the way I described it was that Frank Miller is kind of like 4 different artists in my mind, and 2 of them I really, really like. And this is him at his height, that I love what he's doing, because it's just so fresh and creative, and it feels like it's someone who's just blossoming and just growing into what he's going to be. Ronin is one of my favorite books that he's ever done. It was that book is a huge inspiration to me, and so that's kind of him at his height, then, where I just really appreciate him. Then later on, there's some other stuff with him where I'm just like, there's still talent, but I'm not as excited about it. But the era of him doing this Daredevil stuff, and the one reason I even know about Lone Wolf and Cub, which was another thing, I read the whole series, I loved it. But the main reason I got interested in Lone Wolf and Cub was because Frank Miller was interested in Lone Wolf and Cub and was doing like covers for like the reprints that they were doing in the 80s, and he was inspired by a lot of manga stuff, which again, you can see that inspiration here as well. But the stuff, just the way that he writes it, and the way that the art just kind of flows, it's just a different kind of thing. And of course, I'm only a writer, and so that's a problem for me. Like, as I look at this, I'm like, how can I do this? I can't. I have to pray that my artist is going to be able to like really just knock it out of the park. And I've been blessed to work with some pretty amazing artists. One of them right here, on this panel. But I've been able to work with some really amazing artists. But this stuff, there's very few artists who really get into my heart, and this is one of them. Like, when I just read Frank Miller stuff and look at some of his, especially that early stuff, it just excites me. When I read Ronin 3 or 4 years ago, I was just starting a new project, and I was just telling my wife about this today as I was telling her about this YouTube thing. But with Ronin, I was reading it. We were on a trip up to Canada, and I was also getting ready to write the life of Mary, Mother of Jesus, and his Ronin really inspired just how I wrote that Mary comic. And it just this book itself, as I was reading it, it just got me excited again. Like, it just he gets me excited about comics, and he gets me excited about creating and art. I mean, it's just, that's.
You mentioned Ronin, and I think that I don't want to get too far into that. I want to stick to this book, but I think that's one of his most unheralded works. And I was
Yeah.
thinking about that as I was reading this, and maybe we want to come back and do a special on that or something someday.
I think so. I have a special hardcover edition, but I have one that I bought at a used bookstore when I was in film school. And when I read that, I was just like, oh man, it just blew my mind how amazing it was. So, yeah.
Okay, so we haven't heard from you yet, Coach Vic. What do you have to say about maybe your first impressions about the book?
I've read and listened to a lot over the last few days, so hope this all didn't just rumble together. By the way, it's nice to know that you guys have a YouTube channel. I've been watching and listening to old podcasts. Okay, went to Google Podcasts, hit Around Comics, and there you go. But is Frank Miller the one that would go to a company and say, "Give me your worst comic"? And that's what I'll write and take care of, or am I getting them confused with somebody else?
Well,
that's a Neil Adams. Neil Adams claimed that he would do that. That he did that with the X-Men. Yeah, we just did. We actually just did an episode on his run on the X-Men.
That's where I heard
sort of.
And there
whether or not it was true.
Yeah, there are stories.
You said this was a bad comic.
It's like
this wasn't selling, I guess, and that's what made me think of that. But
well, Daredevil
really
certainly was not. Yeah, it was a bad selling comic before Frank took over, and that was why he was given it, because he was a new creator at the time, and so he was given the art duties, and he did that for about 6 or 7 issues, I think, and then he wasn't really happy with the scripts that were coming in, and he had done a backup story, and there was a change in editor. At the time, Denny O'Neil took over as the editor of Daredevil, and he recognized Frank's talent, and so he moved the writer that was on Daredevil to a different project, and he let Frank write and draw the book. And Ben, I was gonna ask you, because I was, growing up, the initial this run of Frank's on Daredevil. I loved the art. It was like, wow, this is some of the greatest art I've ever seen. I fell in love with Frank Miller's art. And it wasn't until years later that I realized that a lot of it in this, and then like Dark Knight Returns, is Klaus Janson, and, inking, but doing a lot more than your typical inker, almost finishing a lot of the art in this stuff. Now, you mentioned Ronin, though. Ronin, though, is much more Frank's, straight artwork. Do you sort of distinguish between the two, or and Coach, I'm sorry I didn't mean to sidetrack you. I just, that popped in my head, and I wanted to ask Ben about that.
No, except for in the later stuff. Like, I'm trying to remember if Dark Knight 2, if Klaus was on that. I don't think he was, but that just,
I don't remember. Yeah, I'd have to look.
That one, I just remember reading it and just wanting to love it, and just the art just didn't connect with me at all. And so like. But I don't make much of a differentiation. No, I mean, it's just, okay. But part of it is just also, it's not just the art, but it's the way that the art and the words work together. And that's one thing where I feel like I'm at a real disadvantage as far as like, I'm just a writer, and, so you see someone like Frank Miller, where he's able to determine like what words are going to go on the page. And, there's pages in this book here where it's just this amazing combination of words and panels and words and art that just kind of, they flow with each other and they wrap around each other. The page I'm thinking of in my edition here, there's no page number, but it's this one here. Like, this is the first one that I think of when I'm like thinking about that, like just the way the storytelling works, where it feels like this could be just a pinup, one image, but because it's drawn up in the panels, time is moving as the page is going, and then you have the laughing that's going across the page, and then you have all the narration that's happening, which is this internal narration, this first person thing. The whole thing is Bullseye narrating, and that page, there's a whole lot of words on there, but it still just really flows, and it's because of this writer artist combination that he's able to really control how all of that works all together. And
I wonder how much of that is Joe Rosen was the letterer on Daredevil during this time too, and I wonder, he would
have been a big part of that. Yeah,
You would think,
Because-
right? Like I want,
because
I
he's
don't know if
placing all
Frank
that
was,
stuff. Yeah.
yeah. But if you look at like Dark Knight Returns, the same, you have the same sort of things. You know, he's using lettering as almost a third character a lot of times, or a third, you know, design element in the book. I see what you mean with that for sure. It adds so much. I always go back to Alex Toth. I think Alex Toth was one of the greatest at using sound effects in panels and in pages. I think, you know, he was a master of that.
Well, and Will Eisner too. Like a lot of this book particularly, that makes me think of Will Eisner, the way Will Eisner would just make the panels and the words just flow together and you know, turn titles into part of the art, you know, and that sort of thing.
And that makes perfect sense because Frank worked in Will's studio.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a great point.
I had a artist that I worked with once who he would place all the balloons first because he would do the lettering as well. And he was a graphic designer first and then became a comic book artist. And he would place all the balloons first and then do the artwork around the balloons so that the words flowed first. And that it was really interesting. And I don't know if that's what Frank was doing here, but and I would doubt it actually for this. I don't think he was placing the words in this book. But
as far as the relationship between words and pictures, I think he's doing a great job of handling the text, not talk about what's going on in the panel. You know, it's almost two different things. You can go and read the text as a book and you get one thing, and then you go and look at it picture by picture, and it's, you know, they're related, but they're not necessarily attached.
Well, and the text enhances the art rather than explains the art.
Right.
Well, you also have that juxtaposition that you can kind of only get in comics, where you can be saying one thing and showing something completely different. And he does that. I mean, the first scene, a page is Daredevil getting shot in the head through a scope of a rifle, and we realize it's a fantasy. It's Bullseye's fantasy, but it's a hell of a way to open a book.
Well, and even beyond that, where you have the reader knows that who Elektra is to Daredevil. And then you have this whole back and forth about, oh, that's Matt Murdock's girl. Too bad it's not Daredevil's girl. Wish it was Daredevil's girl that I was killing right now. It got a little bit. That's probably the weakest part of the writing there, is just how much it goes back to the, boy, I sure do wish I gotten Daredevil's girl. But it totally, you're reading it and you're seeing it, and the words are saying one thing, the art is showing you something else, but then there's also a layer of you as a reader know something that the narrator doesn't know. And
Absolutely.
it's brilliant.
Coach, I completely sidetracked you. I know you were going to talk about your thoughts on this, so I'm sorry. I apologize. I have a tendency to do
fine. That. I'm here for knowledge, but no, I love the book. I mean, I'm not gonna lie. I was intimidated because like everybody kept coming back, man, it's a great book. This is a great book. This is a great book. I'm like, man, I'm not gonna read this because, you know, I'm going to be the one person like, it was all right. So I was just like,
still love you.
This is a good book. It was a full story. I know he talked about how sometimes, or back then, the books were mainly standalone stories or full stories almost. I love that about it, and I just was really entertained. It really was. And by far, I think then this probably gets into you a little bit, Jamie. But Bullseye's out uniform. I like that. Like it's wasted on a bad guy.
The fact that he's not in his uniform through the whole thing, is that what you mean?
No, when this is my first time seeing it. You know, this one.
By the way, there you go.
Oh, just the design of Bullseye's uniform?
Yeah.
There you go. Put it up again.
By the way.
There you go.
Well, I think you bring up a really great point as far as like the character development. That was something, you know, if you look at Elektra, you know, spoiler alert, but Elektra is killed in this book. And she was just introduced 13 issues before this. You know, he introduced that character 13 issues before, and she's this really interesting and unique character. Matt, has a history with her, and then she has her own life that goes sideways, and then we kind of meet her again, and then he ends up killing her off, and obviously, she doesn't stay dead because it's comic books and nobody stays dead. But the idea that
spoiler,
what I found so fascinating about this book was you had a character. This is the first time I saw a villain with a motive other than trying to rob something, or trying to to just get the bad guy or get the good guy, or trying to have his own sort of like narcissistic thrilling adventure. This was a villain who had been dropped, broke his back. I'm sorry, that was later, but he had been defeated by Daredevil and left on the train tracks, and he's in prison. He has a brain tumor. He's dealing with these headaches. He has all this backstory and all this stuff that Frank has given him now, and he's dwelling on it. I'd never seen a character like that, a villain given that kind of motivation, where he's dwelling on the fact that he was beaten, and now he's locked away, and he's mocked by the Punisher of all people. The Punisher, and that was another thing. It was like just that little sort of thing of like Frank Castle's in prison with him, and comes up to him and sort of just twists the knife in him, saying that Kingpin is getting rid of him and going to let him rot. He's not breaking him out, hoping that he'll do something stupid and get himself killed. What a great little one page is all it is, but it's just a great little moment. But the whole buildup of this book of that he did with these characters, these three characters, Elektra, Bullseye, and Daredevil, I don't think you really had seen that to this point in comics that much, and I think that's what really got people so interested in this book.
One of the things I wanted to point out so I've read this probably 3 times in my life, and the last time was probably about 3 or 4 years ago. Probably I read it in the omnibus, but reading it fresh, and I mentioned this before the show, this is the first time I realized that the whole story was told from Bullseye's point of view. And I'm sitting here trying to think of, was there any other instance of that other than maybe in a backup story or something like that, where the story is really told, from the villain's point of view, where we get to hear his motivations, what's going on inside his head. Nothing else comes to mind earlier than this.
Yeah, I don't. My memory's not good enough to make a claim on that, but yeah, I don't know that there was a lot of it. And you certainly saw a lot of it after this. Yeah, even Frank did it a lot after this, and that was one of the things too, that struck me was so many parallels to this in like his later work, Dark Knight Returns specifically. The idea of a villain breaking out of prison using a TV show host to get away. He does the same thing with the Joker.
Yep.
The helicopter escape, he does that in Dark Knight Returns, and there's just these parallels, these things you see him sort of building to. If you consider Dark Knight Returns his magnum opus, it's like you see it in this, you see it in Ronin. I think you see a lot of things in Ronin too, sort of building to that book, and a lot of similar kind of storytelling devices that he created and used.
I'd also like to.
Go ahead, man.
I was going to say, I also like to point out that I also bought this off the shelf, brand new, 2 weeks ago. They did a facsimile edition. It was $4.99 cover price. I'm not sure what your cover price was there, Brian, but it's I love these facsimiles where it's got all the old ads in it still. Like it's got the Cracker Jack ad, and there's a Hostess ad and the Lone Ranger ad on the back. But yeah, I was trying to figure out, how am I going to read this, and then I just happened to walk into our local comic shop, and oh hey, there it is. Okay, this is great.
Our shop over here.
Yeah, over at Buy Me Toys. Yeah.
Yep. Pick that up tomorrow.
Yeah, this was expensive back then. It was $1. It was a special double-sized issue. So it was not, I don't think it was twice the cover price. I think cover was probably 75 cents at the time. Maybe
That
not.
definitely
Maybe it
Well,
was.
the funny thing, I noticed when I downloaded it, this issue was $2, but the next issue is $1. So
It's a double side issue. He only had like 25 issues that he wrote for Daredevil, wrote and drew, but two of them were double size issues.
Yep.
So he just had a lot of story to tell, I guess.
It's interesting. I mean, the whole storyline is the Elektra saga, which, as Brian said, there's stuff that happened before this, and then you have the resurrection. That's like maybe the quickest resurrection in comics. But he for the body of work that he did in this run, if you go back and read just the issues with Elektra in it, it's less than a quarter of his run, I think. Especially earlier than this, it's like maybe you might see her every other issue. But I was surprised when I read the omnibus that I didn't see her kind of consistently introduced in 168 and appearing in every issue up until 181, especially.
Yeah, that was one of the things, like reading it too. What Frank does really well is you said it at the beginning, he doesn't talk down to the reader. He lets you fill in the gaps. And there's pages, transitions, and panel transitions in here where you would see a lesser writer sort of putting in more panels or putting in description or putting in narration, where he just lets you assume, no, you're going to fill it in with your mind. You're going to fill in those gutters with your imagination. And that's, a thing that a lot of writers, I think, don't do. They don't trust the readers to make that leap on things. And with Elektra, it was the same thing. He didn't need a ton of stuff, or a ton of issues to really give you a character. You kind of bought into that character right off the bat. She was very popular, and this was a huge deal that she was killed. I mean, at the time, I'd have to go back and look, but I don't know how many major comic book characters were killed off before this. I'm sure there were some, but not a lot. It wasn't. The
death of the Phoenix was a couple years before this, but yeah, I'm sure people did not see this coming.
Yeah,
when this
I know I did.
I mean, it says it on the cover. One wins, one dies. I mean, it's 50-50. Who's gonna make it?
But we didn't have previews. We didn't have comic book resources telling us what's going to happen months in advance like we do now.
I mean, this is comic book dying too. So,
how popular was Bullseye back then? I'm familiar with him a little bit just because of, again, reading Spider-Man. But was he even a popular character back then?
He was relatively popular. I mean, obviously Frank had made him much more popular than he was, just because Daredevil wasn't that popular. But he had appeared in Daredevil before, quite a bit before this, I think. But he was a totally different type of character. He wasn't this deadly assassin. He was much more of your typical Marvel villain, at the time. So Frank turned him into something much deeper and darker, and he became. He did the same thing as like what he did with the Joker. He turned the Joker into a much more three-dimensional character that people, even though he was vile and this horrific killer, he was intriguing. There was more to him.
I loved this scene in this where he's outside the window and the guy's smoking and just that was so. I really enjoyed just the whole, watching him and learning more about him and all that kind of. But that scene right there just cracked me up because it was just, I could totally envision, this guy. He's got this nicotine fix and here's his cigarette, and then obviously he took that opportunity to go in and take a bunch of those guys out. But yeah, that scene to me just cracks me up, and it's such a huge character builder. Of the character. I thought it was really interesting.
There's a perfect example of what I was talking about too. Like on that page, the last scene, he's got that knife. If you look at the last two panels,
yep.
He hits the guy in the face, and there's that knife with the sort of spikes on it sticking in the ground. And the next panel, he's holding it in this guy's face. a different writer, I think, would have shown that him picking it up.
Yep.
Would have felt like, insecure about not showing that. But no, Frank just assumes you're going to figure it out. He picks it up and sticks it in the guy's face. That's the kind of thing that I think, a guy, he was 22 years old too when he's writing this stuff. The sort of confidence he had. Pretty amazing.
Like I could really just see I would have been more than happy to just read the whole. This one titled Bullseye instead of Daredevil. I'll be looking forward to the next few issues.
This is a great. That's a great quote or a message by Dave Enrique that in one of Bullseye's appearances before Miller had Daredevil propped up on a giant crossbow. Yeah, that was the. It was much more of the Batman TV show, the sort of 60s era, bled into the 70s and that kind of thing. It was silliness, and
he was gimmicky.
Yeah. For me, like one of the I wanted to ask you guys this question because I've thought about it before and it struck me again, like the final death of Elektra, the final, where Bullseye sticks that her own sigh through her. I was thinking about it because it's like kind of a silly, it's an iconic shot, in comics now, but if you look at it, it's kind of silly. Like, why wouldn't that thing go through her shirt?
That was the first question that I asked.
Well, it did go through her shirt in the front.
It did go in the front. but I bet you what it was in looking at it this time when I was thinking about it, I bet you they couldn't. Show a knife sticking out of someone's back. This was as close as they could get to doing that. I bet that was an editorial thing, or at least a sort of. I'd be interested to ask Frank that question if I ever get the opportunity.
I was thinking they couldn't show a bloody weapon, but she's definitely bleeding out in the next panel.
Yeah, but I was wondering about that with the blood though too, because the blood is never red.
Yep,
it's always black or it's some other color. And I was wondering if that was the same thing.
Red and black blood is one way you can avoid getting an R rating. Like you can change the blood to black with CGI or change it to red if it was already black, and then you're going to change the rating. When I did the Sworn Sword for Marvel, we did a cover, and one of the covers had arrows going through a guy's body, and editorial told us we couldn't have that. We couldn't have. You could see the arrow in, but you couldn't see it through, and so it was just the exit wound. I think might be what the editorial might have been on that.
Yep. Dave Enrique's got the knowledge there,
right?
Shooter being the editor-in-chief of Marvel at the time.
Good old Jim Shooter. I have a funny story about Jim Shooter, if you care.
Let's hear it. Yeah,
I was at New York Comic Con. We were set up at a table, and we were sitting with Carmine Infantino. Tom and Carmine Infantino are sitting there talking for about an hour. And Carmine being Carmine, everybody in comics that passed by his table stopped and said hello, shook his hand. And Carmine was very salty. He was a funny, a typical New Yorker, grumpy kind of guy. And you see Jim Shooter comes by and stops and shakes his hand, says, "Hey, Carmine, great to see you, blah, blah, blah." And he walks away. And after he's out of earshot, Carmine turns to Tom and he says, "Jesus, he got fat." And that was Carmine, and it was an interesting time hanging out with him at that show.
Jim Shooter is a monster of a man. He split like 6'8" or something like that. He's huge.
Yeah, he's a big guy.
So during this show, we like to take a pause every now and then and talk about the history of kind of the world at large, kind of outside comic books, what was going on. And we usually task Coach Vic with a summary of some of the hot news items of the day. Are you ready with your report?
Yes, sir. I'm even going to shorten it down a little bit.
Okay.
Just the good stuff.
Hold on. Before you start, can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
How old was everyone? Was everyone alive in 1981 on this panel?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. How old were you guys in 1981?
In 81,
81.
I was 7.
I was
Wait, so
11.
83.
I have to do the math.
Actually,
I think it was,
we're all wrong.
I
It's
think it was
82.
Oh, it's
But-
82? I thought it was
But
81.
we've got facts for 83, so let's go with that.
Eh,
I was 8 then, so
all
I
right.
was. Which year are we going with?
82.
I was 10.
More comfortable.
I was 11 until the end of the year. My birthday's in November, so
So the on sale date for this was December 29th of 81, but the cover date was April of 82. So
okay. So I really screwed up our historical facts.
83 is such a great year, though.
All right, let's see what happened in the next year. Let's hear it.
All right, so the final episode of MASH, a show I've never watched because it looked depressing, had 125 million people watch it.
one of the
Surprisingly
greatest,
funny show.
greatest TV
Yeah,
finale
but
of
the
all
opening
time.
was so
almost.
depressing. Yeah.
Well, it had moments of
And-
depression. I mean, it was a war, but it was surprisingly hilarious for a war show.
Well, and Return of the Jedi wasn't the only Star Wars that being talked about. President Ronald Wilson Reagan introduced us to Star Wars at the time. Oh, that's me coming through you.
nope.
So we got Star Wars from President Reagan. He introduced Star Wars for our air defense system. Sally Ride was the first woman in space on the Space Shuttle Challenger. And a great dance was brought to us in 83, along with a doll called the Cabbage Patch Doll, which brought us the Cabbage Patch, which I'm not going to do. Video games. Can you say Mario Brothers? Dragon's Lair? Mike Tyson's Punch Out?
Oh, yeah.
Nice.
It was great to be a kid. You got Rock, Inspector Gadget, Reading Rainbow, and the Disney Channel. And movies. Anybody want to play a game?
Hold on.
Global nuclear war.
Coach Vic, let's fix your audio. What's going on with your audio?
Pete, hit mute.
Mine?
Yeah.
All right,
How's that?
that's better.
Yeah.
Keep going.
So we have Trading Places, great movie. War Games, great movie. Superman 3, starring Richard Pryor and Superman. Flashdance, Staying Alive. Music was unbelievable with Michael Jackson, Billie Jean, Beat It, New Edition, Phil Collins, David Bowie was killing it. And Prince gave us 1999. And Air Supply was added to their greatest hits back then as well. So it was just a great time for movies, to be a kid, for music, TV. And if you were into Star Wars, the movie and the defense system. That's just a few. Oh, most importantly, Motorola introduced the first mobile phones.
Very cool. It's always good, I think, comic books can be a time capsule to a certain extent. So I think it's always good to take a look at the history. But I mean, who's not going to look through an old comic and like Ben's facsimile, check out the old ads. I think this ad was probably done by Neil Adams' studio, just because it looks Neil Adamsy. So it's good to just take a pause to reflect on what was going on around the world at the time.
Gotta love the ads in comics and old. I miss the good ads, the weightlifting stuff and X-ray specs and all that fun stuff.
Yeah.
But I will say I do have, because I have the original issue, but I do have the omnibus that you're talking about as well, and the new coloring that they do on those are pretty amazing. It's like a different experience sometimes with some of that stuff. I think they did a great job on the Daredevil ones.
I need to sit down and do a side by side. I know on cartoonist kayfabe this week that they did a comparison of the absolute edition of Batman Year One came out, and it's got 2 volumes in it, and one volume has the original coloring, and the new volume has one of the anniversary edition color recoloring.
Those guys are responsible for that other book that's sitting on my desk, the Absolute Dark Knight Returns, because they talked about it, and I'm like, well, I got to buy it now. I have to.
Yeah,
I have to get it.
Those guys are doing exactly what I hoped I could do, but they do it so much better. So I'll do my thing. Enjoy
we
their.
just had Jim Rugg on the show. He was just on.
That's right.
Sunday, I think, something like
I forgot
that.
about that.
All the dates are bleeding into one another. I don't remember what day it is anymore, but
I'm right there with you.
So the one thing I did want to mention on this issue, I don't know if there's been a cooler line said by a bad guy in a comic before throwing a ace of spades into someone's throat, but the line, "You're pretty good, but me, I'm magic." That's one of the great villain quotes. Like, I remember reading that and just like thinking that's the coolest thing you could say to someone before killing them. Not that I would ever kill anyone, but if I ever found myself, that's just that brought another, like, a whole different element, a whole different feeling to Bullseye, because you felt his sort of narcissism in this book. Like, you realize why he was a bad guy. It was all about him. Everything was about him. And the reason he hated Daredevil so much was because he couldn't live with the idea that he would be beaten by anyone, and I know someone, I read a review of this book, and someone had said, it was kind of weird that, he figures out who Daredevil is. He figures out Daredevil's Matt Murdock. He tries to convince Kingpin of it. But then when he breaks into Matt's apartment and he sees the dummy, and then Daredevil confronts him, he quickly changes his mind. And they're like, that seems pretty, fast. Like, that seems like poor writing that he would do that. But if you think about Daredevil, he probably still didn't believe it himself, because he couldn't believe that a blind guy would ever be able to beat him. He would never allow that to enter his mind fully, I think. So I think it kind of follows that character, that he's so
like
driven
Lizzie
by
Borden
his
thing, right?
Yeah,
How
he's just
they couldn't believe a girl could kill people.
right.
There's no way this blind guy can do this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, even though he kind of convinced himself that he could, it was quickly something he disbelieved, because I think it was just more of his narcissism, more of his, disbelief that anyone could beat him, let alone some blind lawyer.
Well, what was interesting about it is, like, Daredevil's whole thing is based on heightened senses because of lack of sight. Bull's eye, like his power, like, is he can aim and hit anything. It's all in his sight. I mean, there's other things, he'll do things without looking and things like that. But the idea is, like, he's this marksman, and it's all this vision based thing where he can figure out the angle, he can do but it's Bull's eye. And it's just this interesting, I like heroes where it's a natural dichotomy, where it's not just like Superman, Lex Luthor, there's a natural dichotomy with the two of them.
Sure.
Where it's not just, we're going to, hey, let's make up the opposite, and get the opposite. But that's the same thing here, where there's this opposite thing going between them, but at the same time, it's natural, it makes sense. And in some ways, I think it might even been accidental.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't even know who created Bullseye. I'm trying to think of who was the actual creator of Bullseye, because it wasn't Frank.
No, he came out.
It was Gene. Well, no, it wouldn't have been Gene Colan. I don't know. Yeah, that's an interesting observation for sure.
I'm just glad he didn't say. He said I'm magic instead of saying I'm aces, because
not nearly as cool. That's kind of cheesy.
No. That's more the dad joke than the cool supervillain.
But think of, like, I mean, I don't know if you like some of the cool things that Frank thought of how to use Bullseye's powers, if you want to call them powers. The cards, the playing cards, the pill. Being able to use the pill to distract shoot it into the guy's eye, and even just like the handgun, he runs out of ammo and he ends up taking out a guy in a helicopter by just throwing a pistol, at a guy's head. I just think that he kind of, reinvented the character in that way too, of like finding unique ways of going, okay, this guy can hit, kill you with anything. He's so deadly. His aim is perfect, and he can use anything as a weapon. And I think he kind of showed that to a higher degree than we had seen before with that character. Not to take away from giant crossbows. I mean, that's
Well, did he continue to be kind of a serious villain down the road? I mean, again, I'm trying to remember him with Spider-Man, and I feel like I remember him being kind of goofy.
You probably read appearances before this, I'm betting.
Okay.
Or it could be a writer not taking this into account in his writing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But yeah,
I mean, if you look, I'm sorry,
Bullseye had made one or two appearances in Miller's run before this, and had made, I don't know how many appearances before that, but several. But this book definitely changed him in the minds of writers and fans, I think.
I think you had, to sort of understand the time and the change that Frank Miller and other writers too, obviously, but Frank was a big part of it, from the 80s, the early 80s, from 1980 to 81, and then 85 and 86, culminating with Dark Knight Returns, that kind of thing. The shift in the tone of comics was huge. It was seismic. You went from something that was more for kids and more fun based and sort of silly, to something much more serious, more like this. Everyone followed suit. Comics got much darker and much more serious, and you saw it somewhat in the 70s. With Neil Adams, if you look at his stuff on Green Lantern and Green Arrow, that kind of thing, they were dealing with issues. But this really created, Frank and Alan Moore with Watchmen created this, very seismic shift in comics where everything then became much more serious, and all the characters, just character development, and in my opinion, it went over the top. It got too dark. Things just escalated to the point where it got ridiculous, and then you entered the 90s and it became this extreme era of comics. But this was the beginning of that sort of shift, I think, in a lot of ways. And I think it wasn't just Frank, but he was a big part of it.
Yeah. And so a little bit of background on him, and you don't see it as much in this issue other than in backgrounds, is that he was living in New York City. His run on Daredevil really involves the city almost as a character, more than just a background or more than it's just a setting. And part of that was, he lived there, but also I've heard him tell the story about how he was mugged like twice, and it was that the 70s and 80s downtown New York was not the safest place to hang out. So that's definitely influencing him in the subject matter and the tone he uses in his writing. Pages like this, like I said, he's not really talking about the city so much, but the fact they're on like an L train, the city in the background, and you see he's famous for having I don't know if it's on this page or one before, the water towers in the backgrounds on the rooftops and things like that. So he's using the kind of the darker visuals. He's pulling it from his own surroundings and planting them in his stories. One of the things that I picked up on just examining this from the art standpoint, or maybe just the panel layout standpoint, is he's he squeezes a lot into his pages for one, but he's really taking advantage of very narrow panels.
Mm-hmm.
Where in most cases, in this page, we've got vertical and horizontal, but in most cases, he's using horizontal panel layouts, but he's kind of spiking these like staining figure panels throughout the issue, where he's really focusing on different characters at different points in the story, and he
uses that a lot. Wow.
Yeah. So yeah, you've got you've got Bullseye there.
That Kingpin page.
Come to the page with the Kingpin.
Yeah.
This one here where Mr. Cheese was talking about the scene outside the window. Yeah.
The death scene, the morgue page.
Yep.
Yeah. Wow. He uses that a lot in here.
So is
There's
that
pages that are all verticals.
What's that?
There's pages that are all verticals that are just 4 or 5 vertical panels, and yeah, he definitely used that a lot in this and in other work too. But it is interesting how much he tended to use it in this book particularly.
What's interesting to me is there's so many panels on every page. So there's a lot of stuff going on, but it's still that double size issue. Like this comic could not be shorter. Like this is, if it had been a single issue, it wouldn't have been nearly as impactful. And like it needed the room to breathe, but even with room to breathe, it's crammed on the page.
And
it's pretty efficient. There's not a whole lot of wasted stuff. There's not a ton of wasted dialogue, and the only thing that you gets expanded as like the combat. He sort of delved into that. He really kind of gave a lot of pages to combat when you finally got to it.
Mm-hmm.
But there wasn't a lot of wasted space for sure.
Well, and that's where I would say the Lone Wolf and Cub, and I can never pronounce the guy who did that series, but I think that's a lot of influence you're seeing here. I don't know if he discovered Lone Wolf and Cub before or after this, but I'm going to guess before. Like the way he's using just the visuals and the fight sequences and letting those fight sequences just play out. Yeah, I think that there's probably a lot of influence of that in this. I'm guessing, though. I don't know the timeline on that.
I don't either, but I would guess you're right. I know he had certainly been influenced by manga and Lone Wolf and Cub in particular, but I don't know the timeline either, but probably.
So let's finish up our discussion by talking about the book in a larger context. We mentioned that it was, for Frank Miller, is kind of his first major stepping stone, going from the heck.
One of those guys. What's going on over there?
Not sure what's going on over there.
Hey Ben, while I got a second here, I just wanted to ask you. You are aware that your camera's upside down, right? That's
what?
Not. You're not unaware of that, correct?
I don't. It's not for me. Yeah.
It's not for me either.
Okay. Hopefully, it's not on your live YouTube.
Really?
Yeah, I don't know why. Yeah, that's funny.
If someone in the chat can tell us, is Ben right side up or is he upside down? Because he's right side up for me.
Wow, that's really weird. Yeah, you've been upside down the entire time for me. I just thought it was something you did.
No,
I was like, that's weird.
You know, when I got on, you said something like, "Oh, Ben's hanging from the rafters." And
yeah,
I had no idea what that meant. I'm like, there's bookshelves back there.
Yeah, you're. Wow,
Okay,
that's
good.
really weird. I don't know why just for me, you're upside down, but you are absolutely hanging upside down.
That's really funny.
StreamYard does do some weird things like that once in a while. Dave Enrique brings up an interesting point. First appearance of Bullseye was drawn by Bob Brown. Brown would use repetitive drawn figure to show action in panels that Miller would emulate.
Dave Enrique. Who is Dave Enrique? This guy, you know, he knows his stuff.
People in this community, they know their stuff. They'll drop knowledge at the any chance they get.
I always made it clear I was not an expert in anything because more often than not I was guessing, and you know, I have maybe an educated guess, but you know, yeah, I don't have the memory to claim expertise in pretty much anything.
Oh, on the last podcast I listened to, you sounded like you knew everything. So,
well, listen, it's not what you say; it's how you say it. If you just say it with confidence,
There you go.
people are going to believe you. I mean, we have a president that kind of has illustrated that better than anyone could.
He hangs his hat on that for sure. So, like I was mentioning, in the bigger picture, so this book kind of was Frank Miller's first big stepping stone to go on to do bigger things like Dark Knight Returns and move on to do Sin City and 300 and things like that. So, but Sal, in your kind of collecting career, what impact did this book have on you as far as what came after it?
Oh, well, I mean, I was a Daredevil fan for life after this book. I mean, after, you know, Frank Miller's run on Daredevil, I was hooked, and I collected Daredevil up until, you know, probably 6 or 7 years ago. I got rid of a lot of the books. I still have my Frank Miller run. I still have some early stuff, but yeah, I collected anything Frank did from that. I'm a Frank Miller apologist. I own everything he's done. You know, I can't necessarily defend everything that he's done, but I'm one of the people that will certainly, if you have a couple extra hours, I'm more than happy to defend Dark Knight Returns or Strikes Back, the second Dark Knight book. I know it's hated. It's not beloved like the first one, but I'm more than happy to defend it to people. So yeah, I became a huge Frank Miller fan. You know, anything that he did, he was sort of the initial guy that if his name was on it, I was going to buy it. And it turned me into that type of a collector where I was looking at the guys that were writing books more than the art for a long time. And even till today, I'm much more likely to buy something if it's a good story with okay art than a mediocre story with great art. I need character development. I want to see an evolution, you know, even if it's a monthly periodical, even if it's, you know, Spider-Man and every story's been told, I want to see something happen. I need a story to go somewhere, and I need these characters to develop even just in that story. So that was the effect that it had on me. It sort of changed this book. Watchmen, certainly. American Flag by Howard Chaykin was a book that really influenced me early on. Like I said, I was reading a lot of stuff I probably shouldn't have been reading when I was young, but that was all the stuff that really it also gave me appreciation for sort of the auteur, the guy that was doing everything. And you know, you mentioned the cartoonist kayfabe guys, and you know, guys like Ed Piskor and Jim Rugg and you know, Charles Burns and guys that do it themselves, that write and draw everything together. I have such an appreciation for that, and can even be, you know, more forgiving on the art side of it because it's so hard, it's so difficult to do, and it's something I'm so jealous of as both a failed writer and a failed artist. I can't do either very well. You know, it's like I have such an appreciation for someone that can do both, and you know, so guys like Chaykin and Frank and that kind of, you know, absolute geniuses in my opinions that could do it both very well was something that I gravitated toward, and I still do. But you know, there was also comics got dark, comics got over the top, and you got people that were trying to be successful emulating what these creators had done, but they didn't have the chops, so they just went darker and more violent and more bloody, and you got a lot of bad books after this kind of thing. So you know, there was a time period where I wasn't really thrilled with a lot of comics in the 90s, and I mean, there were still good things out there, and there always is. I mean, there's, I buy less comics today than I ever have in my life, but there's so many good comics out. You can find stuff for anyone that is of the best quality that have ever been made, in my opinion. I think, there's more good comics being produced today than there ever has been. There's more stuff that I'm not into, but I shouldn't be. I'm almost 50. Nobody should be writing comics for me, really. I mean, Ed Brubaker still does, but that's because he's 50. You know what I mean? Guys like that. But I'm not into Spider-Man. I don't really read Daredevil. But yeah, so that's kind of how this book and Frank's run on Daredevil really, changed my view on comics.
Cool. So Dave Enrique had a couple more comments I thought were interesting. Wait, no mention of the What If story that it was inked by Terry Austin. That's a memorable book. I mean, for What If stories, that's one of the ones that I remember. What If?
I remember it existing.
It was one of the rare occasions where the creator came back and did his own What If story. Frank Miller did the art and writing in it.
Huh. What if?
Yeah, it was what if Elektra didn't die? Right. That was.
Oh, actually, I looked that one up.
David,
I have to admit, I don't really have a recollection of it. I was never a fan of What If stories.
Really?
I was never. I don't know why. For some reason, because they weren't. I don't know. There was something in my brain like these aren't real.
Right.
Which is weird because today all I want is like Earth 1 Superman, or like outside of the normal canon. That's the only stories I really enjoy anymore. So yeah, maybe I should go back and read that.
I like the What Ifs because it in an era where you couldn't research anything on the internet, you got that first 3 or 4 pages that recapped a major storyline, educated you on that, and then by the end of the issue, the world came to an end. That's pretty much it. Everything. Yeah. Everything was. It ended worse than the books really did.
Right. It's a good point, though. To have them come back and do that again is kind of interesting. That you would think almost it would be sacrilegious to a creator to do that, but well, not Terry Austin. Terry Austin, he'll ink anything,
So,
but
NASCAR or Bronco fans, what makes a great, long-lasting comic book? Example: Green Goblin stands the test of time because of action, drama, fighting, and saved loved ones all at the same time. Curious. I'm not sure what the Green Goblin part refers to, but as far as, in my opinion, a great comic is just that combination of great art, great story, and kind of like what Sal was saying, that there are serious stakes involved that evolve the characters to some extent.
Yeah, I was just trying to think of one of the things that struck me about this book in particular is I am an author. I'm not a successful author in the least, but as I was reading this comic book, it made me want to go back and think about how I write prose. That it was so impactful. I was like, man, this is really good writing. And so, I've only read it like twice over the past couple of weeks, but it's something that stuck with me. And so to me, I mean, that's pretty telling that it's a good story, that in and of itself kind of catches me, because I've read, comics lately, and none of them have made me want to improve in my writing ability, so this, to me, that's one of the things that stands out, is that, if it makes you think about the craft better and more, I think that's a pretty good sign.
All right, so we'll wrap this up. I'll let everyone on the panel give some last thoughts. Coach Vic, what do you think?
Like I said, I really like this, and I mean, Take your time. I like Daredevil based on the Netflix show. Okay, that was my first time being introduced to him. Okay, I really like this book, but it made me really like Bullseye. I want to learn more about Bullseye. And I don't know, maybe that's a black hat in me. I don't know, but I really like the storytelling. I like the panels. I like that. It's like everything about this, and wow, yeah, it was great. Like,
Mr. Cheese, what are your final statements?
I really liked it. It was good. It was surprising. I enjoyed the perspective from Bullseye rather than Daredevil, and it's made me pick up. Because of this, I local library has a digital copy of Daredevil's The Man Without Fear, the paperback. So I'm checking that out because this made me want to read more about Daredevil. So I like
the actual book, not the digital copy.
No, the digital copy.
Oh.
No.
Yeah, that was good. Before we get to Ben, that was giving me my question for you two. You both seemed like you responded more to this than some of the other works that we read. Sal, we've read 2 issues of Claremont and Byrne X-Men so far. We did 136 and I think 140. We've done a Golden Age Shazam, the first appearance of Captain Marvel Jr. Done an issue of Nightwing and the first issue of
Hercules.
Yeah.
Hercules.
So we kind of. I think
the miniseries, the old.
Yeah, that was my pick.
Series?
That was my pick.
I love that. I loved that book when that came out.
So it seems like, other than the outlier, well, we've got 2 outliers. We've got the Golden Age book and we've got the more modern Nightwing book. But so far, we've been kind of dwelling in the Bronze Age, and I think that just goes to show like what age group we're talking to. Yeah. But it seems like you guys kind of dug into this one a little bit more. Are you, Pete? You said you're going to go back and read Man Without Fear. So, are you more inclined, maybe with this book, to dig in more than you have with the others? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's part of it is I've had just a little familiarity with Daredevil because of Spider-Man versus the other stuff. Like the other stuff was, a lot of it was newer to me. And so, I don't know. Yeah, this one kind of piqued my interest. And so I think I'm going to check out more Daredevil stuff and cool. See where that takes me.
Yeah, me, I'm definitely, I mean, Alan Moore just got bumped off my list of books I'm going to be reading here the next year or so, because Daredevil or Frank Miller and then Daredevil. I'm really curious. I really like the writing in this, and I'm just really curious about that. I mean, I've been wanting to watch The Watchmen, but they're only doing 1 season now on HBO, so hey, I got time.
All right, Ben, let's get to your final comments.
Yeah, I think I showed. This just really energizes me as far as just it's good. It's good art and good writing, and it's the full package. But at the same time, you started talking at the beginning about how be positive and stuff like that. I would say what I like about this is one of my taglines on my comic book podcast is if you're not enjoying your comics, you're doing it wrong. And like this is the kind of thing that it just energizes me. I want to read more like this because it just gets me excited about the art form. And yeah.
Very cool. So Sal, I'll let you wrap us up. And feel free to tell us about what you've got coming up on Around Comics that we can keep an eye out for too.
Sure. Well, first let me say thank you guys for having me on, and thanks for reaching out and just helping to promote our YouTube channel and everything. I really appreciate it. It was a weird, like, coming from when we were doing podcasts in the 2000s, like every podcaster hated every other podcaster. Like, had a comic. No, that's a kind of an inside joke, but no. So I just wanted to say thanks a lot for having me on. It's been a lot of fun, and yeah, on Around Comics, I think we have Next week, we're going to talk to Ryan Brown and Charles Soule. Also, I think we're going to talk to Christina Merkler from DCBS about their new deal with DC Comics distribution, the new one of the new distributors for DC Comics, and then who knows what, we'll talk about. We got some more Comics 101s. I'm supposed to do a Shazam Comics 101, which I'm researching right now, so that's taking some time. But yeah, as far as this book, I'm glad you guys liked it. It's I think a creator like Frank Miller, who has a wide range of work, and I think one of the most impressive things about Frank is he's always been experimenting, even till today. The stuff you look at now is different than what he did 40 years ago. And he's always sort of pushing the boundaries, and it's not always going to be a home run. But I love the idea that, you could pick up this book that was written, all these years ago, decades ago, and the concepts and the character development and the story narrative that's in it, you could find this on most shows on Netflix today. Like, you know what I mean? The bad guy, you're intrigued by the bad guy. This was something that was sort of novel in the 70s, kind of the anti-hero in the 70s was really, in film, you saw a lot of it, but in comics, it was kind of new. And, I think you look at guys like Robert Rodriguez, who was, inspired by Sin City and by Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns and those kind of books. And I don't know, the countless amount of creators that have been inspired by him and by Watchmen and these kind of things. There's a reason that we see today this gigantic, boom of superhero movies and the success that they have. And even though the comics maybe haven't followed suit yet, it's the characters. There's something about the medium. There's something about these characters. There's something about the talent that is driven to make comics for years and years and years that somehow creates these amazing stories that have been able to last forever, last for 40, 50, 60 years. It's amazing. Spider-Man and Superman and Batman. It's like, how are these characters able to survive all this time from the most humble of beginnings? So it's really an amazing thing. And I love the idea that you guys liked this and were intrigued by it and want to, delve more into Frank Miller's work, because he's one of the all-time greats in comics for sure. And this is kind of where it all started. So it's a great place to start looking in his stuff. And like I said, there's stuff of his that I will make apologies for, but there's stuff of his that even I can't, I can't necessarily do that. But I think it's, it is what it is. I think it's like he's not the guy that's just going to sit there and keep giving you what you want.
Mm-hmm.
It's like Bob Dylan going from acoustic to electric. He wasn't going to just sit there and give you what you want. He's going to do what his muse tells him to do, and sometimes it's going to be amazing, and sometimes it's not. But I'm going to sit around and wait for the amazing, because I know when it hits, it's going to be unbelievable. Yeah. And maybe he's past that at this point. We've probably seen the best of his work, but the best of his work is pretty amazing even today. Mm-hmm. To be able to sit down and read it and enjoy it is something to say for sure. So that's it changed me as a comic book fan, as a reader, as a collector, and I'm glad you guys liked it. So thanks again for having me on.
Very cool, and thanks for coming on. I think Frank Miller, like Sal said, is one of the all-time great creators. He's one of the guys that, if comic books is like a southbound train, he came along and he turned it east. I think so. The work that he did really impacted the industry in ways that we wouldn't be here with all these movies if we didn't have things like The Dark Knight Returns to show us what Batman could be, that went on to inspire the '89 Batman movie to some extent. And then, that movie springboarded to, all these other movies we've seen since then. So I think we, as fans, we owe him respect in the least, if not just a boatload of gratitude for the work that he's done. In my kind of pantheon, as far as Frank Miller works, this ranks pretty high. I might have only maybe 5 or 6 of his works that I'm really huge fan of, and then there's some I enjoy and some I ignore. But the good definitely outweighs the bad, that's for sure. But I want to thank everybody for joining us. Thanks, Sal, for coming on. Thanks to Ben, Coach of X7, and Fantastic Mr. Cheese for joining us. And I'll sign us off as like always. And remember to keep your priorities straight. Faith, family, comic books. We'll see you next time.